So, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out of your schedules to attend this very special Sunday afternoon installment of Community and Climate. My name is Jack. I'm a librarian here with the Sunnyvale Public Library. I'm very, very excited to welcome you to this program to discuss all things PFAS and forever chemicals. To do that, then, we have an incredibly special guest, perhaps the most special guest we've had across this series, investigative journalist, and of course, the author of They Poison the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. Mariah Blake is live with us on Zoom today. Hello, Mariah. Thank you for being
Hello.
with us.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you.
Love that. Well, to share a little bit more about Mariah and her work, Mariah is an investigative journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Mother Jones, The New Republic, Columbia Journalism Review, and other major publications. She was a Murrey Marder Nieman Fellow in Watchdog journalism at Harvard University, and her reporting has taken her deep into some of the most consequential stories of our time. Her book, They Poison the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals, is the product of nearly a decade of investigation into PFAS, the class of synthetic forever chemicals now found in the bloodstream of virtually every living person on Earth. The book follows their rise through everyday products like nonstick cookware and stain-resistant fabrics, and exposes the decades-long campaign by chemical manufacturers to conceal what they knew about the dangers. At the center of it all is the story of Hoosick Falls, New York, a small town whose residents took on some of its largest chemical companies in the world and won. Since its release, the book has been widely celebrated. It was a finalist for the Penn E. O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and was shortlisted for the J. Anthony Lucas Prize. So, before I have Mariah properly introduce herself, again, please turn off your cameras, mute yourself for the duration of the presentation, and if you do have questions, please feel free to place them into the chat, and we will get to those at the end. With that, Mariah, I will let you introduce yourself and take it away from here whenever you are ready.
Yeah, well, I want to say how grateful I am to be here with you all. Thank you for taking an interest in this issue. It's always extremely rewarding to talk to people who have read the book or who are engaged, who care about this issue. I love to hear what kind of questions they come up with. And Jack and I are going to start with a conversation just between the two of us, but you all will be invited to join the conversation later on. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's take this opportunity to jump right into the discussion.
okay.
Then, and I think it's important for our audience to have a kind of foundational understanding of what the chemicals that we'll be talking about today. So, for anyone who hasn't read the book or is otherwise unfamiliar, can you explain maybe what PFAS are and why they're called forever chemicals?
So PFAS, the formal name for them is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, although they're more commonly known as forever chemicals. And this is a large family of chemicals that have some really amazing properties that make them extremely useful. So they're extremely resistant to heat, to electrical currents. They stand up to chemicals so corrosive that they burn through all other materials. And this has made them useful for all kinds of applications. So they helped usher in the era of space travel and high-speed computing. They have led to life-saving medical devices. They've also transformed thousands of everyday items, everything from lipstick and dental floss to furniture and clothing. On the other hand, they are probably the most insidious pollutants in all of human history. We're talking about a class of chemicals that persists in the environment for hundreds or even thousands of years. And one document I saw in the course of my reporting suggested that the time scale for some of them may actually be in the millions of years. Um, those that have been studied are highly toxic, even in the smallest doses, and they are literally polluting the entire planet, including human blood and ecosystems in the remotest parts of the world. Um, and I could give you, one or two examples of just how ubiquitous they are, but they are in all of our homes, they're in all of our blood, and they are in the blood of virtually every living being, including those in the Arctic, in the deepest parts of the ocean. They are literally everywhere.
It's quite an insane like fact to hear. Did that scale of how embedded these chemicals are in modern life surprise you even after years of reporting?
I was continually surprised and continually discovering new ways in which they are, embedded in our life. So these are chemicals that are used in makeup, in body lotion, in kitty litter, in dental floss, in children's clothing, in furniture, in cookware, in cell phones, solar panels, artificial turf, building supplies. They are used because of these unique properties that they have. Anything that is nonstick, grease-proof, waterproof, most likely has these chemicals in them. But because of their unique properties, yes, I was constantly surprised at just how embedded they are in our daily lives and our society. And I think one example of this is there's actually a layer of Teflon. Teflon is a form of PFAS in the Statue of Liberty. So even the very symbol of American freedom is uh, basically the skeleton is encased in PFAS.
Yeah, I think you and I have discussed how layered this topic is, and your reporting took close to a decade. It took essentially a decade to make and cover. What first pulled you into this story, and was there a moment where you realized this was just bigger than Hoosick Falls, for example, the town that you covered, and their water contamination?
So in some ways, this is a very technical story about a class of chemicals, but actually, at its heart, it's a story about people and people of remarkable courage. And the way I found this story really stems from one group of people of really remarkable courage. And this was so a decade ago, I was reporting on another class of toxic chemicals, and I happened to stumble across this lawsuit that this family of West Virginia farmers had filed against the chemical giant DuPont. DuPont manufactures Teflon, which is a form of PFAS and which is made with another form of PFAS that's highly toxic. So this family of farmers had sold DuPont some acreage for a landfill, and after that, their cows started sprouting tumors, vomiting blood, and going blind. And in some cases, the farmers themselves were falling ill, and eventually the cows started dying off faster than the farmers could bury them. Now, the farmers were convinced the landfill was to blame, and so they eventually, after a long series of events, brought suit against DuPont. And their lawsuit had revealed this breathtaking cover-up involving the Teflon chemical PFOA, which is a form of PFAS. Um, it was clear that manufacturers had known for decades that it was toxic, that it was in the blood of people all over this country, that it was polluting drinking water supplies all over the country. But this information had never come to light until the farmers brought their case. So this is a group of humble West Virginia farmers. So in 2015, I wrote a story about these farmers and their legal battle with DuPont. Um, and it left me with a lot of questions. The primary question being, how was this allowed to happen? So, how was this small group of companies allowed to pollute the entire planet with this class of chemicals without regulators, the public, or even independent scientists knowing that they existed? And so I decided to dig deeper. And I ended up discovering that the answer stretches all the way back to our nation's founding and the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and the original DuPont patriarch. Um, and and so, I ended up writing a book that has two threads. One is this historical thread that tells the sweeping history of the chemical industry and its relationship, the chemical and munitions industry, because really they're one and the same, and the relationship with the US government and how that has shaped many aspects of society, including the way we regulate chemicals. And then the other tells the story of a small town and their battle to get clean drinking water. So it is both very much a current day story, but it also delves very deep into the history.
Yeah, and perhaps that's what, you're able to do with a book as opposed to, a string of articles, which is what makes the book so intense and detailed. Early on, you make a connection in the book between the PR playbook between big chemical use and the one that big tobacco later perfected. Can you maybe walk us through that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so what I discovered in the course of my reporting is there are certain tactics that we tend to associate with big tobacco. The suppression of internal science, the attempting to control what's in the scientific literature. All these tactics we associate with big tobacco I discovered that these actually came from the chemical and fossil fuel industry. So the chemical and fossil fuel industry pioneered these tactics during the battle over leaded gasoline. So there was some big debate when leaded gasoline was first introduced onto the market in the 1920s about whether it should be tested for safety or whether basically scientists should test the effects of airborne lead before it was released onto the market. And there was a large contingent of public health professionals who argued that it should. Industry argued that wasn't necessary. And the lead spokesperson for them was this scientist. His name was Robert Kehoe, and he articulated this principle. His argument was that products that could benefit society, that could lead to progress within society, shouldn't be held off the market based on some theoretical future risk. So that products should be presumed safe until proven otherwise. And in the end, Kehoe prevailed, and this became the ideology that underpins our entire system for regulating potentially toxic substances. So all of our laws governing the safety of chemicals in food or in the environment essentially grandfathered in the vast majority of chemicals that are in circulation today. In fact, the vast majority of chemicals in circulation today, the 80,000 chemicals that are in circulation, have never undergone any form of safety testing because they have been presumed safe. Um, and what this system did was it created an incentive for industry to game the science, because as long as there was doubt about the health or environmental effects of their products, there would be no regulation. And in fact, it was this same scientist, Robert Kehoe, who pioneered many of these methods. So he was secretly studying, or not, in some cases secretly, in some cases openly studying the health effects of leaded gasoline, and dominated the science for decades. And dramatically underplayed the potential health and environmental effects. And that is why leaded gasoline remained on the market until the 1980s. So my book essentially describes how the chemical and fossil fuel industries pioneered this scientific misinformation playbook that now is used by all kinds of, it's used by fossil fuel industry. It was used by the fossil fuel industry. It's been used um, by, football leagues to discredit science on traumatic brain injury. It's been used in all kinds of ways, but its origin really dates back to the 1920s.
Yeah, it's quite mind-boggling to think about, if not maybe surprising, I guess, unfortunately. What is surprising is you trace the origins of these concerns, as you mentioned a moment ago, as far back as the country's founding, and you mentioned as far as back as Thomas Jefferson. And in the book, you draw an even more direct line to this mass production of PFAS during the Manhattan Project in the
Yeah.
1940s. Are you able to maybe expand on this relationship a bit more? I suspect that a lot of us wouldn't have put those two things together.
Yeah, so this is something that shocked me when I first discovered it. It was not a piece of the story that was out there when I began working on my book. So this class of chemicals that is ubiquitous in our environment, in drinking water, in human blood, that is in thousands of everyday products, was developed by the US government as part of the top secret Manhattan Project. That was the project to develop the nuclear bomb. And the reason they were needed was for uranium enrichment. So uranium enrichment involved this incredibly corrosive substance that couldn't be contained by stainless steel. It couldn't be, there's almost nothing that could contain it. And Manhattan Project scientists determined that the only substances that could were those that combined chlorine, I'm sorry, fluorine and carbon, which together form the strongest bond in chemistry. And that is really a defining characteristic of PFAS, and that is what gives them their remarkable properties. And so they set up this major nationwide program to develop these chemicals, which there were a couple of very small samples that had been developed as a result of laboratory accidents, but they'd never been produced on any kind of scale. And so just as there were physicists uh, and physicists working in labs all over the country to develop nuclear fuels, there were chemists working in labs all over the country to develop PFAS, or forever chemicals that were then known as fluorocarbons, for use in the Manhattan Project. Um, Now, the interesting thing is that it was clear almost from the get-go that these were dangerous chemicals. So the plants where they were manufactured were prone to fires and explosions. Workers were constantly being hospitalized with breathing problems and chemical burns. But it wasn't just the workers who were affected. Uh, Around 1947, I believe, farmers downwind, I'm sorry, it was earlier than that. Around 1946, farmers downwind of the plant began complaining that their peach crops were burning up, that their cows were so crippled they couldn't stand. They had to graze by crawling on their bellies. And this alarmed Manhattan Project officials, and they actually began secretly studying the health and environmental effects of these chemicals. The US government in the 1940s was studying the health and environmental effects of these chemicals, and they knew as early as 1947 that they were highly toxic and that they accumulated in human blood. Um, and yet, the US government not only allowed them to be mass produced, but played a role in them going into mass production.
Yeah, and you know in the book too that PFAS went into mass production at a DuPont plant in New Jersey during the Manhattan Project itself. What did that wartime secrecy mean for the oversight of that plant?
Well, there was no independent oversight of it, because it was top secret. Uh, and in fact, there had been, the FDA at some point had attempted to investigate the high. It was evident that there was something polluting the crops surrounding the plant, and they actually were going to put a ban on selling produce from that region. But Manhattan Project brass, the very top Manhattan Project official, intervened to keep that from happening. So, um, but then, after the war, then this company called 3M. Most people know the name 3M. It's based in Minnesota. It makes Scotch tape and other things. Uh, it acquired a patent to produce this technology and then hired Manhattan Project chemists to help turn them into products that could be marketed to the general public, and also to other chemical companies. And so very quickly, these chemicals started to appear in American homes in the form of Scotchgard, for example, fabric protector, in the form of Teflon pans. Um, so they very quickly found their way into really all of our homes. So if you were to test the dust in your home, if you were to take a sample and send it into a lab, there is almost 100% probability that there's a variety of PFAS lurking in your household dust because of the products in your home.
You mentioned that in the book as well. By the 1970s or 80s, these manufacturers were secretly testing some of their own workers and finding links to birth defects and cancer. What did that internal testing look like, and how did these results get buried? Like, how deliberate was that effort?
It was it was very deliberate. I mean, it was part of the strategy. And it dates back even further than the 1970s. So, these big chemical companies do a lot of research internally on the health and environmental effects of their products. And they don't necessarily release that information to the public, but they are collecting data on all of these substances. So it was clear from the 1960s, both DuPont and 3M, the two main manufacturers of these chemicals, knew that they were toxic as early as the 1960s. As early as the 1970s, they knew they were accumulating in the blood of people all over this country. So one of the things that's unique about these chemicals, not only do they persist in the environment, but they stay in our bodies for a very long time. So a lot of them have half-lives between 4 years and say 16 years. So people with high levels will carry these chemicals in their body for their entire lifetime. Um, so but not long after they discovered these chemicals were accumulating in the blood of people all over this country, they began testing the blood of people around the world. So 3M specifically tested thousands of samples from people all over the world, including remote rural China. And they also tested archived samples from past medical studies. The only samples they could find anywhere in the world that did not contain these chemicals were archived samples from Korean war vets that were collected before 1952. So that is around the time that 3M began mass producing them. So they knew as early as the 80s and 90s that these chemicals were in the blood of basically every person on the planet. That caused, not surprisingly, some concern within these companies uh, about the effects these chemicals would have on human health and the environment. And so they began intensively studying those questions, and they quickly discovered that they didn't break down in the environment and that they were associated with all kinds of health effects in workers, including kidney cancer, leukemia, dramatic drops in testosterone, markers of organ damage, markers of immune suppression. But I think the most important finding was birth defects in workers. So in the 1970s, 3M had conducted a study that found that rats who were exposed to the chemical PFOA, that's the Teflon chemical in utero, developed eye defects, so defects of the eye and nostril. So DuPont decided to secretly study female workers at its Teflon plants to see if there was a similar connection. It called it the DuPont dubbed this the pregnancy outcome study. And the official goal, according to internal documents, was to determine whether this chemical caused, quote, abnormal children. And it turned out that the answer seemed to be yes, because 2 of 7 pregnant women that gave birth during the course of the study gave birth to children with eye and nostril deformities very similar to the ones that have been found in rats. However, rather than disclose this information to the public or regulators, DuPont simply canceled the study and continued exposing female workers to these chemicals, but also continued releasing these chemicals into the environment. Although there were very simple steps the company could have taken to reduce or eliminate emissions of these chemicals by putting filters on their smokestacks, etc. So the company made a choice to continue exposing all of us to these chemicals.
I think that acts as maybe a good transition to talk about the people themselves that you cover in this book, and specifically Michael Hickey as acts as a core part of the narrative that you create, and is really the emotional center of the book. So with Michael not being an explicit scientist or an activist proper, what made his story the right entry point for you?
So I think it was a combination of who he was and the circumstances. So by the time Michael Hickey came onto my radar, I was already working on this book. I planned to write a book, and I thought the human dimension of the story would be these farmers in Parkersburg, West Virginia that I talked about before. But as I was researching stories about this community of Hoosick Falls, New York, began cropping up in the national headlines. And so this community had just discovered, this was in 2016, that their drinking water was contaminated with PFAS. But the way it was discovered, and this is what made the story interesting, was that this local insurance underwriter, Michael Hickey, had decided to test his own drinking water after losing several friends and his father to cancer. Uh, and he wound up discovering that the local drinking water had extremely high levels of PFOA. In fact, the levels were 100 times the EPA's current safety standard for this particular chemical. So I was intrigued, and I decided to travel to Hoosick Falls to meet Michael. Uh, and he was just nothing like I expected. So he's this unassuming insurance underwriter with a fear of public speaking. He likes to joke that he gets his political news from ESPN. And yet somehow he was spearheading this fight against several multinational companies and government agencies to get his community clean drinking water. And other people had joined him in the fight, and they were equally unlikely activists. So there was a young mother. She had a high school education, had been a teen mom, had put everything she had into a dream home for her family, only to discover the private well was heavily polluted and that her children had blood levels on par with DuPont factory workers. There was the beloved local doctor who had noticed that an unusually high share of his patients developed rare aggressive cancers before being diagnosed with a rare cancer himself at age 42. Um, There was a high school music teacher, conservative evangelical Christian, whose daughter's blood levels were extremely high as well. And so these were people much like Michael who had never taken much of an interest in politics or environmental issues, had spent their lives trusting that there were systems in place to protect them. And now that trust had been shattered. And so, mind you, this is the first Trump administration. And so this theme of mistrust of public institutions loomed large. But rather than becoming resigned or cynical, rather than wanting to burn it all down, which was kind of what many people seem to want to be doing at that moment, these people had decided to fight like hell to change the system because they thought that was the best way to protect their families and communities. And they very quickly started making some pretty remarkable headway. So within a few months of my first visit, New York became the first state to regulate PFAS. They designated a hazardous substance, which means that the companies responsible for the contamination actually have to pay to clean it up. Seems common sense, but that is not the case with PFAS in most parts of this country up until this point. So, anyways, I didn't know exactly what I was witnessing, but I had a sense it was something powerful, and so I decided to spend more time in Hoosick Falls and see where these people's struggle led. And I ended up following them for 8 years. I was there for birth of a child. I went to church with them. I went to family dinners with them. I basically embedded myself in their lives for 8 years.
And rightfully so, you described this story as a David v. Goliath story. If there ever was one, this would be the one. What did organizing look like on the ground in this small town up against DuPont? And what worked and maybe what almost didn't?
They did everything they could think of. So they lobbied politicians, they staged protests, they filed lawsuits, they spoke out in the media, they stayed up all night reading scientific studies so they would be well versed enough in the science. Because in 2016, almost nobody outside scientific circles had heard of PFAS. In fact, they weren't even called PFAS at the time, they were called PFCs. So, person Googling these chemicals today would find a wealth of information, but these people they had to be better informed than regulators. Um, they filed public records requests. Anything you could think of, anything they could think of, they did. And along the way, they discovered some hidden strengths that made them particularly effective advocates. So Michael, he mumbles. He's not particularly articulate necessarily, although he's gotten better. He's really like evolved in ways that are really impressive. But at first he struggled with public speaking a lot. Uh, but he was really talented at maneuvering behind the scenes, at finding people who he could put in roles who would then, be very successful in those roles. So, for example, he persuaded the high school music teacher to run for mayor of Hoosick Falls, and he did, and he became mayor, and he really helped to turn things around. So he saw a skill set in Rob Allen, this high school music teacher that other people hadn't discovered yet. Emily Marpe, had been a teen mom, high school education. She developed on a command of the science that blew mine away, that blew away all the state regulators, and also just an ability to boil down these really complex subjects into these simple language that hit people in the gut. So I was with her. We went one day. They were invited to lobby Congress at some point, and I remember her going from office to office and telling her story and just seeing the amazing reaction that people had to her. And she would say things like, "The American dream was ripped out from under us," which I think is just crystallizes her situation in a way that just is incredibly powerful. So uh, but they had to feel their way into this role. It was not something that was natural to any of them, but they all had natural strengths that made them very well suited to the role in different ways.
Yeah, and perhaps this question is redundant, but I think you talked about some movements like this maybe becoming cynical or that people become resigned. Um, and especially they become stalled against very well-funded opposition too. What made PFAS relating organizing different? Was it, the science becoming more accessible, like you mentioned, or, the personal health stakes for these people, or was it something else?
Well, so I think one dimension of it is something like climate change. An issue like climate change is abstract to people. I mean, obviously the effects are very concrete, but not in the same way as knowing that there is a toxic chemical in your drinking water, in your children's blood, in your breast milk, right? This just it. So I think these people they were devastated, they felt violated, and and as a result, they were incredibly passionate and dedicated. So I think that and I think that because because it's in people's drinking water, and this I think the thing is this chemical is in drinking water at least as much so in red states as blue states. So it tends to be around military bases because it's used in firefighting foam. So the water, it's in white working class factory towns. So both Parkersburg, West Virginia, where the farmers live, and Hoosick Falls are Republican strongholds. But it doesn't, when your children are drinking poison water, that I think it doesn't matter what your theoretical political stance on environmental issues is. You don't want your children drinking tainted water. So I think that is why they were so passionate and invested. But I think part of the reason the issue was able to gain traction is just the pure numbers. So as I was following the events in Hoosick Falls, more than 100 million Americans learned their drinking water was contaminated gradually. So today, more than half of all Americans are known to be drinking water that's contaminated with these chemicals. And as people began learning their water was contaminated, variations of what was happening in Hoosick Falls began happening all over the country. So you had unlikely activists, firefighters, farm workers, suburban moms, military families standing up and demanding action from their political leaders, filing lawsuits, doing all the things that happen in Hoosick Falls. And I argue in my book that this is really the most powerful grassroots environmental movement since Silent Spring. And you started to have really dramatic changes. So on the federal level, the two best known, best studied of these chemicals were designated hazardous substances. So again, this requires those responsible to map the scope of the contamination and to pay for cleanup. They set federal drinking water standards for six of these chemicals, which is, that was a huge breakthrough. But I think the more important progress happened on the state level. And so I think this speaks to why the strategies were effective. It's partially because they targeted institutions that tend to be less partisan and more responsive to individuals. So mainly state governments and the courts. And so states, so far, more than 30 states have passed at least 200 bills restricting PFAS, including a number of full or partial bans on the entire class of chemicals in consumer goods. Now, that is revolutionary because that is not how we regulate chemicals in this country. In fact, that's not how we regulate chemicals anywhere in the world. We normally regulate them one by one. You also, and interestingly, this is a trend that has only accelerated since Trump was reelected. So there are additional 200 bills in state legislatures, including some in California right now. Um, and you also have this tidal wave of lawsuits. So there's 1,500 lawsuits pending against manufacturers, a lot of them individual liability, personal liability suits. And this combination of these two factors combined with regulation that's on the horizon in the EU is actually prompting large swaths of the economy to voluntarily move away from these chemicals. And I think the most dramatic example of this is 3M. So 3M, the company that first developed PFAS, was the world's largest manufacturer for the last 70 years. It got out of the business earlier this year, so it quit manufacturing PFAS completely because of liability concerns, all the legislation in the pipeline. So this is largely as a result of individuals and communities like Hoosick Falls that this Fortune 500 company made this step. But there's also, for example, 40 major retailers with about $2 trillion in combined annual sales have committed to eliminating or radically reducing these chemicals in their products or packaging. And we're talking about huge corporations like Amazon, Apple, McDonald's, Home Depot, many companies that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being environmentally uh, conscious. And it's largely because of the liability potential. Um, the PR, nobody wants to buy products with PFAS in them because there's been so much publicity surrounding them. And legislation is pushing companies because of all the legislation, companies are having to go through their supply line and figure out where the PFAS is. And once that information becomes public, it's a huge PR liability. So you have, as a result of all of these individual actions, you have this cumulative effect, which is actually quite dramatic. And I think, has the potential to move us to the kind of tipping point where moving away from PFAS is more lucrative for companies or more financially viable for companies than continuing to use them. So that's the hopeful message, in what is, in some ways, the topic of the book is somewhat, there are depressing elements to it, but there's also a very, very hopeful undercurrent, and it has to do with the power of individual action and collective action to drive meaningful change, even in today's political climate.
Yeah, it is nice to know that it is a hopeful element, even though if it's just for maybe good PR. But whatever works, I suppose. You just mentioned actually, the shift towards regulating whole classes of chemicals at once. This was, of course, opposed to how regulations have traditionally worked via chemical by chemical. What does this actually mean, and what does this actually
Okay,
change?
so PFAS is a class of about 12,000 chemicals. And if you regulate them one by one, it's going to be God knows how many years, centuries before you can regulate them all. So scientists and have long argued that it make more sense to group chemicals because chemicals with similar structures often have similar properties and toxicity profiles. And we know this about, so a lot of people have heard of bisphenol A or BPA. Well, BPA is part of a whole class of chemicals called bisphenols. And, a lot of them have the same properties that make BPA so harmful. And when BPA has been banned in baby products, for example, in the United States, manufacturers are just replacing them with other chemicals that have similar properties and that are equally toxic. And so you have this game of whack-a-mole. So regulating the entire class is a way to prevent that, to prevent one bad chemical from being replaced with another. I think the unique threat posed by PFAS, because they don't break down in the environment, because they have all of these properties that make them uniquely harmful, has prompted regulators to actually take this step. So these state level laws that ban PFAS as a class. So Maine and Minnesota have actually banned the entire class in all consumer goods, except those that are necessary for health, safety, and the functioning of society. Um, those are the first bills, I believe, to ban an entire class of chemical ever in this country. Now, Europe is also weighing a class-wide ban on PFAS. Um, but what you're starting to see in states that embraced a class-wide ban on this class of chemicals are starting to ban other chemicals as a class. So now that this is in the sort of legislative toolkit, it's being expanded to phthalates, bisphenols, other chemicals where there's a large group of chemicals that are known to be harmful. Some of them are associated with health problems on a population level. So um, and yet we just aren't able to effectively regulate them with the tools we have. So the changes that are being made to address the unique threat posed by PFAS is actually shifting the regulatory framework in a way that can make us better able to address the problem of toxic chemicals generally.
Yeah, and you just mentioned a couple of states, including Maine. You also talk about Texas and Minnesota that have been fairly aggressive on PFAS regulation. To take it maybe a bit closer to home for us in California, Where do you think our state fits into the national picture? And
Just to be
oh yeah.
clear, Texas has not been aggressive on
Oh,
PFAS.
my
There were
mistake. My
bills
mistake.
that there were bills in the state legislature. There's no law those did not pass. But Maine and Minnesota have been
Hmm.
extremely aggressive. As I say, they have banned the entire class of chemicals. They have set very strict limits on these chemicals in drinking water. So they banned them in consumer products and manufacturing. They've designated them hazardous substances. Um, and there's been, industry has flooded these tiny states with lobbyists, and they have pushed back. They have resisted making all these changes that the chemical industry wants. California has taken some big and important steps. So, for example, it set very strict limits on 6 PFAS in drinking water. It has banned these chemicals in firefighting foam. So, firefighting foam is one of the leading causes of PFAS in the environment. There's firefighting foam that's used in every airport, military base, and firehouse in the country, or was for decades, that has PFAS in it, and that it's a major source of PFAS contamination. So California has banned that. They have banned PFAS in certain consumer products, menstrual products, paper, food packaging, clothing, and cosmetics, I think. And they've also designated the two best known and best studied PFAS. They are so they have to be labeled under Proposition 65 in California, which I'm sure all of you see the Proposition 65 warnings everywhere. Um, but there was some disheartening news last November. Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed a bill which would have enacted a more aggressive ban. So it would have banned PFAS in cookware. Let me see, I have to look at the list here. Cleaning products, toys, dental floss, and food packaging. And what happened was the cookware giants all over the country started pouring a lot of money into lobbying in California. You had these celebrity chefs like Rachel Ray come out against the PFAS ban, all of which have Teflon cookware lines. Um, and so that bill was, even though it passed the state legislature, was vetoed by Gavin Newsom. Um, so California has actually not stood as firm as a lot of smaller states with less market power. And obviously, what happens in California, as I'm sure you all know, is very important because California, if it were a country, would have the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. So just the fact that California, that products have to be labeled under Proposition 65 if they contain PFOA or PFAS, just those two chemicals, has drastically reduced the amount of those chemicals. Um, it's been associated with decreases in people's blood. So California has the power to shift markets in a way that few other states do, that no other state does really, that few other countries do. So um, I personally was a little disappointed that Gavin Newsom caved to the pressure he was obviously under. I think one factor is that PFAS are also really integral to a lot of high-tech applications. So they're used in semiconductors and lithium-ion batteries, and obviously um, these things play a role in Silicon Valley. So that, I think, that was a dimension of the decision as well. However, I should note that all of the PFAS bans that have been enacted in these states, they all include exceptions for applications that are essential to the health, safety, and functioning of society. So lithium-ion batteries, there's currently nothing they use to coat the lithium cathode iron. I'm sorry, there's nothing that you can use for a certain application in these that works besides PFAS. So, um, for semiconductors, they are needed for certain kinds of electronic chips. Those applications would be protected for as long as there is not um, alternatives available. But there are many applications, for the majority of applications, they are either completely non-essential or there are alternatives available. But industry is making, I think, some red herring arguments about our ability to progress technologically and the effects on the economy uh, that don't take into account that there are exceptions built into most of these bans.
Yeah, and for the sake of time, I think I'll try to ask you one more question and open it up to our audience here. But and perhaps broadening the scope a little bit, since your book has been released over the last year, the EPA has also moved to weaken some drinking water restrictions on certain PFAS. And it's more nuanced than that, as you and I discussed. But can you explain the basics of what's happening here and what they're proposing?
Well, so they have so there were the EPA under Biden set drinking water standards for six PFAS, and the current administration has rolled back four of them, but kept in place the two of them for the best studied and best known PFAS. Um, and the other major thing that had happened on the federal level was the designation of PFOA and PFOS, these two best known and best studied forever chemicals as hazardous substances. So that is a big deal and something that the chemical industry, the military, a lot of there are a lot of parties that fought to kill the hazardous substances designation because it requires responsible parties, as I mentioned before, to investigate the scope of contamination and clean it up. That actually, the Trump administration preserved that and, in fact, went to court to defend it. So, and I think that just speaks to how this issue doesn't play out in completely predictable ways. It's not as partisan as other environmental issues. Now, there's been a lot of, smaller things that have happened on the federal level, but I think the progress that's happening on the state level and the fact that the litigation is gaining momentum more than offsets most of the actions on the federal level. I mean, I think the one thing that is a real setback is the rolling back of the drinking water standards for those six chemicals. Now, a lot of states are responding by actually setting state standards that match the EPA's former standards, but that's not going to happen as much in red states. So yes, you have had some rolling back of regulation under this administration, but less than you might expect.
Well, Mariah, I wanna thank you for your time today and for being with us. It's been such a treat to have you.
Thank you
The
for your
book.
excellent questions.
Oh, my pleasure, truly. The book is They Poison the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. We have it at the library. Please check it out if you haven't already read it. And we do have some time for questions, so please feel free to send those in the chat if you'd like. Don't have any yet. And so I think I might actually kick off with a question that maybe some of us have, if that's all right, Mariah. For people on this call who are hearing about PFAS for the first time, maybe, what is actually in a given individual's control and what isn't? Or maybe more importantly, how does one reduce their exposure to PFAS? Where do they start?
Well, I'd say that the first thing to keep in mind is that your decisions only makes so much of a difference because these chemicals are everywhere and because things are not necessarily labeled. However, there are certain steps you can take to reduce your exposure. These are steps that I personally take to protect my family, and they include one, installing an under sink drinking water filtration system, specifically one that is certified to remove PFAS. So there's an organization called NSF. It certifies drinking water filters, and you can look at the number. I believe it's 53 and 58 are certified to remove PFAS. Um, Reverse osmosis is the most effective. The other thing is to use an purifier or one of the other things. I recommend that people skip microwave popcorn because the bags are often coated in PFAS. Now the formulations are changing as a result of legislation and other factors, but many of them still have PFAS in them. The same goes for fast food packaging. So a lot of it has PFAS in it. Again, the formulations are changing in response to the various fresh pressures that companies are under, but that's still a risk factor. Um, And this is something that I do and that I advise people to do because it not only protects you from PFAS, but protects you from all kinds of toxic chemicals. And that is to use natural materials for cooking and food storage. So things like glass, stainless steel, cast iron, that is a real simple step you can take. And once you have those, those materials in your home, it's just one less decision you have to make. Um, and I guess another thing people can do is avoid buying products that are marketed as stain-proof, waterproof. So a lot of sofas, for example, rugs are treated with waterproofing or stain-proofing coatings. Those most likely have PFAS on them. And if you're wondering, when I look at furniture, buying furniture online, I look for a Proposition 65 warning. Because if it has, you know, that's at least some indication of whether a product has these chemicals in them. I guess there's one more thing. Um, and I almost hesitate to say this, because it's a painful one, but that is avoid eating freshwater fish, locally caught freshwater fish. Because there have been studies that found that eating even a single portion can increase your blood levels of PFAS as much as drinking moderately to heavily contaminated water for an entire month. I'm
That's
sorry.
yeah, quite distressing. I was gonna say I'm pescatarian, so it's quite distressing.
So ocean fish, the levels don't seem to be as high in ocean fish. For whatever reason, surface waters tend to have higher levels. It probably has to do with dilution.
Good to know. All right, we do have some brave souls in the chat who have some questions. Andrea asks, do you have another book on the horizon? What would the subject be, and what are you working on? I guess is a broad question now.
So I've ended up spending a lot of time talking about the book. So, and it came out in German and so I have spent between until May of this year, I was really still talking about this book. I now have some PFAS story ideas in the pipeline, some stories I'm actually working on. I have another book idea that I'm not quite ready to talk about yet. Um, but my goal with this book was always to raise awareness. That was my primary goal above anything. So I will keep talking about it for as long as people keep asking me to talk about it. I feel like this issue it has gotten a lot less attention since Trump was reelected, but the science continues to accumulate. The damning data continues to accumulate. So I feel like it's as important, if not more important than ever, to keep talking about it.
Daniel in the chat is asking a very specific question, which is great. When we're talking about regulating against class of chemicals, does this class include both CF and CCI chemicals? And more practically, are all nonstick coatings on pots and pans PFAS, or are there other approaches?
I'm not sure I know what CCI. Oh, fluorine and chlorine are both. So, um, I think it's just so the way PFAS are defined, um, for the purposes of regulation, or this is the way they are ideally defined, at least one fully fluorinated carbon molecule. So at least one carbon and one fluorine. So um, it's strictly that bond. But I don't know. It differs. I think it differs. What makes sense in terms of definition differs depending on the class of chemicals and what specifically the issue is. Um, but the PFAS bans specifically target just chemicals that have fluorine carbon bond and highly fluorinated, meaning there's multiple connections to a fluorine. That's a little bit technical, but I hope that answers the question.
Well, thank you for that clarification, Mariah. And then I think we have time for one more question, and we do have one more question in the chat from Jay, bit of a two-parter. First, how has this research on this book changed the way you live your life now? And how has your research for this book connected with the intersectional environmentalism with regards to contamination in our environment and water here in the States due to eating animals and the nearby slaughterhouses with their harm to humans? Bit of a
Okay, can you read the first part again, please?
Yes, of course. Sorry, that was a lot. How has this research on this book changed the way you live your life now?
So, and this is going to be a controversial thing to say, but I liken it to a red pill moment, where I see everything through the lens of chemical toxicity. Um, and walking around, because it's not just PFAS, right? There are thousands of chemicals that we come into contact with that are known to be harmful, and especially harmful to developing fetuses and young children, and that are associated with diseases we're seeing increase on a population level. And those, for example, artificial turf. Every gym I go to now has artificial turf in it. You'll see pregnant women working out on the artificial turf. I know there's PFAS in there. I know that it's absorbed through their skin. Um, so I feel, it's like I feel as if, if I had all of the science on smoking and cancer in my head in the 1970s, and I watched the way it feels a little bit like that there's this threat, that people aren't aware of, that they continue to live their lives in ways, people who are very conscious about their health, about the environment, who continue to live their lives in ways that expose themselves and their children to it. And I find it frustrating and heartbreaking. It's also just a lot of choices that I make are informed personally for my family, are informed by the information that I gleaned while reporting this book, but also while reporting on toxic chemicals, because I first began reporting on toxic chemicals when I was pregnant with my son in 2010. And it was largely me trying to figure out how to protect my son as a mother, that drove my interest. So, yeah, it informs my life in a lot of ways. In terms of the intersectionality piece of this, my research is not intersectional. And I think by nature, this is a deep and narrow focus. The book is deep and narrow in focus. So I look at this one class of chemicals, um, and there are a lot of things. There are things that it relates to in terms of, as I spoke about earlier, I do through this class of chemicals tell a much broader story about the relationship between industry, the chemical industry specifically, and government, how that shaped our society. Um, there's a lot of different things I do try to explain through the lens of this class of chemicals, but how it relates to, for example, um, the eating of animals, it's just that is outside the scope, which doesn't mean that I don't think those things are, those explorations are important and valid. It just means that there was a limit to what I could do, even in the context of a book that I spent 8, 9 years reporting.
All right. Thank you for answering those questions. And once again, thank you for being here this afternoon. I cannot thank you enough. I really appreciate your time and you lending your expertise. And yeah, are there any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us before we maybe head out for the day?
Well, I just like to reiterate, I think, when I set out to write this book, I didn't expect there to be anything hopeful about it. And really, it was an incredible gift. It was an incredible honor to be able to witness these people struggle and see the kind of change they were able to bring about, um, under pretty difficult circumstances. So I guess just watching what they were able to accomplish, witnessing their story unfold has given me hope, and I hope those of you, if you read the book, I hope it gives you hope too. I've also wrote a story for the New York Times in May of 2025 that talks about the rise of this powerful grassroots movement and the impact it's had. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, I would definitely suggest people check out that article. But I just think there's some insights to be gained from these people's experience that I think can serve as a guide to those of us who are trying to figure out how how to make a change uh, given the current political environment. And I guess that is the closing thought that I have for people. So thank you.